Welcome to the Governance Podcast from the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society. I'm Mark Pennington, the Director of the Centre here at King's College London. One of the themes we explore here at the CSGS is the relationship between formal and informal institutions in understanding the causes and consequences of the wealth of nations. It's surely unwise to address those questions without considering the ongoing relevance of the Scottish moral philosopher and political economist Adam Smith. Over the years on the podcast, we've had discussions with, among others, Barry Weingast, Deirdre McCloskey, and Jesse Norman to discuss different aspects of Smith's legacy in political and economic thought. Today, I'm very pleased that we have with us Professor Adam Dixon. Adam is Professor of Sustainable Capitalism at Heriot-Watt University up in Edinburgh, where he's based at Panmure House, which happens to have been the last and remaining home of Adam Smith himself. So, welcome, Adam, to the Governance Podcast.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me here today. I'm excited to discuss Smith and his contribution to economic and political thought.
Terrific. So I wonder if we could start off, before we actually get into talking about Smith himself, if you could just say a little bit about yourself and about the position that you have there at Heriot-Watt. How long have you been there, and what's your role up there?
Yes, so I was appointed just last February 2023 as the inaugural Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism. Before that, I was at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and previous to that at the University of Bristol for about 8.5 years. As you can tell from my accent, I'm American, though I've spent quite a number of years on this side of the Atlantic. Most of my adult life, I studied at Sciences Po in Paris, where I did a master's. And then ended up doing a DPhil at Oxford in the UK. And so, yeah, so what is my new position? So I have what I think is an immense honor to have access to Adam Smith's last home. I was approached by a headhunter in the summer of 2022 with a question: would you like to come and be this new Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism at Edinburgh Business School at Heriot-Watt University? And at first I thought, why would they want me? Wouldn't they want a true Smith scholar? And there's a reason why they didn't want specifically a Smith scholar. And eventually I was offered the position, and I started in February, and it's been not quite a year yet. I'm still landing and getting my feet and trying to develop and see where we can go with this. And as we'll talk in a minute here, we have a lot of ambitions for what we want to do as a home of economic and social debate, but also as a place to advance, or let's say re-advance, Enlightenment thinking. In the spirit of Adam Smith and Scottish Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment generally.
That's great, and it looks as though, looking on the website about the Panmure House itself, it looks like there's been quite an amazing restoration project there. It looks like a really amazing space for running events. So can you say a little bit about how the house has been restored, and what the sort of general purpose of that restoration has been?
Right. So before I get to the restoration, it's worth knowing a little bit about the house and its most famous residents. So the house was originally built in 1691 by the Earl of Panmure, who used it as his town seat in Edinburgh. Now, the history is a bit more kind of involved in that, but the more important thing is that by 1778, this person named Adam Smith took out a lease on it and lived there for 12 years until he died in 1790. And we have, there's quite a bit of information on the restoration or the history of the house. But after Smith lived there, so just to say, when he did live there, what's so special about the house, not simply for, I would say, for anyone that is a political economist or a social scientist or historian, knowing that Adam Smith did major revisions to the Wealth of Nations and added a third to the Theory of Moral Sentiments within the 12 years that he lived at that house. Not simply the fact that he died there. It's quite special, and more so is that Panmure House was a place to go to debate ideas. He had regular, Sunday suppers where other luminaries of the Scottish Enlightenment came to discuss the ideas and the issues of their day. Joseph Black, who incidentally discovered carbon dioxide, he was a physician and chemist. James Hutton, who's notionally the father of geology, was the first to come up with the idea of deep time. So this wasn't simply just economics and moral philosophy. This was also discussions about natural philosophy. What I think any intellectual that likes multiple ideas, that's what was happening at this. It wasn't this siloed place that was just talking about, economics, let's say.
Yep.
Edmund Burke, I believe, visited him there. So it has this special place in the history of intellectual thought, of economics, of moral philosophy, of political theory, and we're lucky to have it. Now, after Smith died, it went through various transformations. It was an office for a nearby foundry, I believe. By the middle of the 20th century, it was largely in decay, and it was then rescued by the owner of the Scotsman newspaper, and was turned into the Canongate Boys Club. The owner of the Scotsman newspaper is incidentally the part of the Thomson Reuters family, that very wealthy Canadian media conglomerate family. And they invested money to turn this into the Canongate Boys Club. It was a boys club for a couple of decades, and then it went into the hands of the Edinburgh Council and used for other purposes, but was largely left in a pretty sad state. And then in 2008, the founder of Edinburgh Business School, Keith Lumsden, saw that it was on the market, and had the great idea of, well, Adam Smith lived here, let's do something with this. And the Edinburgh Business School, and which is the graduate school or the business school of Heriot-Watt University, made an offer to the council. Now, what's interesting about the history of that is that they underbid. The highest bidder was a property developer that wanted to turn it into housing. And the council, for good reason, went with Heriot-Watt, which I think, thankfully, it would be a travesty. It would be sacrilegious, if you like, if it were turned into some Airbnbs, which much of that part of town is. And so in 2008, it was purchased, and then money was raised to renovate it, and took 10 years. There was some stops and starts, but after spending £5.6 million and renovating it to a 21st century standard, but still within the style, and it is what it is today. And I welcome you to come and see it, and I hope you will. But it's not a very large space. We have a reading room, which we hold dinners and other events in, and it was the same, what we believe, the dining room that Smith held his dinners in. So when we're sitting there, I always think and say to people, listen, we're in Smith's dining room, and we're dining together. Let's, isn't that exciting? And then we also have a lecture room, and that's where we hold our lectures, and many of our lectures are recorded, so you can see them. And it's not a very big space, and I think that's what's special about it, is that we can only hold around 50 to 60 people in the lecture room, and that was the room that we believe Smith, his study, right? So when people are giving lectures in that room, and this is it was the room where he revised the Wealth of Nations, where he revised and added to the Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he was working on other works that he had burnt at the end of his after he died. So it's just a very kind of special place for anyone that's not simple. You don't even have to be a fan of Adam Smith, but it's just to know that this was a place where someone so crucial to Western political and economic thought, this is where he was, and that's why I feel so privileged to have been given this position to take his legacy forward and to convene and to bring people back to the home that Smith lived in.
Well, I mean, I'd love to come up and visit it myself, and I'd certainly encourage anyone listening to the podcast to check out the website there and think about, if you're passing through Edinburgh, going to pay Panmure House a visit and maybe attending some of the events that you're putting on. I mean, you've got a very interesting program of Smith lectures. Could you say a little bit about those, what the purpose of that series is?
Yeah, so at the moment we have we're in the process. I like to think of us as a startup, right? So it was only officially open in 2018, and then the pandemic came along, and then getting the programming up and running has been slower than I think initially planned. But then obviously I think part of my arrival is to really kick things into gear. But our two, the lecture series that we have, so we have the Adam Smith lecture series, then we have what's called the Lights of Caledonia lecture series, and that one is where we invite people to speak about Scots people's contribution to the world, including Adam Smith. But the flagship lecture series is the Adam Smith lecture series. And so far, we have only been able to do one or two of those a year, but we have plans to develop that. So we're doing at least 4 of these, one a quarter as we go forward, so that we can maximize the house. And I like to think that it's I could find 100 economists and thinkers that would love to come give a lecture. So we're not in short supply of finding people to come. And so far we've had, so most recently we had Neil Ferguson, the economic historian, gave a lecture. At the end of February, on February 29th, we have Branko Milanovic. We had in this early summer, I believe June, we had Manoush Shafiq, who was the president of the London School of Economics and now is the president of Columbia University. We've had, prior to my arrival, Andy Haldane, who's now heads the Royal Society of Arts in London, but was also at the Bank of England. And the first was Sir Angus Deaton, the Nobel Prize winning economist. And so we're inviting more. Those are the kind of the caliber of people that we want to invite or are trying to invite. So, obviously, like I said, Branko Milanovic is coming. And what you'll notice too is, it's not just specifically, we're not partisan, if you like. So my idea is that we have, the likes of Branko, Milanovic, who, Branko's pretty heterodox. Neil Ferguson obviously is more, you could call him a classical liberal, conservative. Angus Deaton is more, I would say, on the social democratic wing of things, because ultimately, for me, it's, I have what I think about things, but what I find so, and this is where I true to, this is why I think of myself as a liberal, as a classical liberal, is I like to bring in different viewpoints and different speakers to, so it's, I'm happy to bring in a libertarian and also then bring in a Marxist, right? I mean, that's kind of, that's interesting, right? But we don't do that enough.
No, we don't. I mean, that's really what should be happening everywhere, isn't it? That there should be spaces where people can have productive conversations and just take these amazing thinkers and the ideas and just play with them. And there's not enough of that happening at the moment. So that's one of the things I find really exciting about what you're doing. And the list of speakers you've mentioned there, I mean, is really, it's really terrific. So congratulations on putting that together.
Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, it's, fortunately, we've been supported with support from Bailey Gifford has kindly donated quite a bit of money to help us support doing that. And, so nothing's done for free, unfortunately, but I think it's really nice to have the capacity to bring people together. And I say, just the lecture series alone, that's one thing we want to do. I mean, we're trying to, ideally as we move along, I mean, I have ideas for more lecture series, more kinds of, academic symposia that bring together people from the world of business, politics, to just do, like you said, bring these, bring ideas into dialogue, right? Bring different ideas together. And so it's not simply, I think, there's a problem of siloed thinking within academia, but there's also the problem of siloed thinking elsewhere, right? And I think it's the nice part about being at Panmure House is once you're there, you can say to people, if you're, someone from the business world, that, you can sit back for a minute and not worry about, the quarterly report. Let's think more deeply about a particular issue. But just to, mention, go back to what you said, or what, we're talking about in terms of that siloed thinking. And I think that's what's really frustrating for me as an academic, is seeing over the last 10 plus years that the level of self-censorship, I think, within the academy, and not simply the level of self-censorship, but this, instead of just treating ideas for what they are, there's too much attention given to the identity of the person that was writing it, in the sense that, yes, the history, who Adam Smith was as a person is interesting and useful sociologically to understand, but we can still separate him from the ideas. And I think that goes for any number of speakers, right? It's a sense of, but that too often it's, people are looking and saying, look at what happened with David Hume at the University of Edinburgh, taking his name off of the building. You think, well, okay, yeah, that footnote was unfortunate, but, does that mean we need to cancel one of the most significant philosophers of the English language that we've ever had, and who has been, so I would say crucial to supporting free and open debate that allows people to cancel people, if you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, it's a slightly different example, but I think it illustrates the problem of people not sort of talking across perspectives. So I remember one of the first lectures I gave when I started my career, which is like over 20, well, it's nearly 25 years ago, actually. And I was giving a lecture which was an introduction to public choice theory. And basically discussing public choice theory as a kind of special interest theory of the state, a capture theory of the state. And I had several people coming up to me after the lecture saying, when did you become a Marxist? And it was just extraordinary, because they were of this view that if you talked about things like state capture or the power of vested interests, that meant you must have some kind of Marxist perspective. And I had to explain to them that there's, within the liberal tradition, for centuries, there's been a whole focus on capture theories of the state. And I mean, it's an interesting space where you could have discussions between Marxists and liberals about different forms of capture. But it struck me even then that was an example of how, people simply weren't aware that there could be such a thing as a liberal theory of state capture.
Right. No, but just the sense of, I mean, in a lot of my scholarship and some of my collaborations, I've mobilized Marxian thinking, and Marxist scholarship, and I've also kind of included that in lectures. And then, I mean, some people are excited by that, but then you also get the occasional, so you must be a Marxist. And I say, no, I'm not necessarily a Marxist. I mean, I can read and understand that literature, and I can find use in it, but that doesn't mean that I kind of, in my private life, am a radical that wants to, tear down capitalism. I know plenty of Marxists and scholars that are Marxists would hang me for not being true to the radical tradition. But I simply find that you can engage with different types of scholarship to examine particular problems, right? So you could take public choice theory and look at it. Okay, so what does this help us understand? How states operate, and you can imagine, you can put that next to Marxian theories of the state and, the role of class and these different things, and you can put them together. And, you don't have to, believe in Buchanan, but
Yeah.
as a kind of political leader, but you can still appreciate, okay, so this is how the public choice people think about it. This is how the Marxists think about it. And, you might find one more, I'd say compelling than the other. But the point is that we utilize and we mobilize different theories to help us understand contemporary problems or issues or historical development. And that's how we understand our world better. And I find that, unfortunately, there's less appreciation of that, right? There's less kind of bringing, and even when what's the irony for me is that, and you've probably seen this, in the last 10 years, funding councils, universities have talked this big talk about interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. And you think, no, are we actually doing that? Because we're used to do that as a normal thing, but then all of a sudden it's like, no, we're doing this interdisciplinarity, but then the interdisciplinarity is actually just looking at various different theories and talking about them together. But it often isn't happening, even though there's this big push to do that, partly because they want to create something new, when actually the liberal tradition of kind of university life was always interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, and there was engagement across ideas.
But I mean, just speaking about the interdisciplinary issue there, I was wondering whether, you have a background in economic geography, as I understand it. And actually, way back in the past, I did a geography degree as well. And I was wondering whether you felt that economic geography, the nature of the field, is actually more interdisciplinary, and maybe it was one of the reasons that you got into some of these questions, because that space does kind of engage in different perspectives. You have insights from economics, but you also have sociological institutional theories that kind of blend together in economic geography in a way that sort of standard economics, the kind that is conducted in most economics departments, really doesn't engage in those questions at all.
Right. No, so I think it just, by way of biographical background or educational, my undergraduate, I did it in international affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And I chose that specifically, partly because I wanted to be in D.C. because I loved politics and I loved just kind of, it was an opportunity to get out of, I grew up in Colorado, which is a beautiful state, but I have gone eastward since. But I chose that degree program because I could study history and economics and politics and international relations. And there was a huge language component, and I ended up doing a second degree in Spanish literature. And I did that because I was just interested in lots of different things. And that's always been my difficulty, is I've never been able to just stick to one thing. And I remember taking economics courses and thinking, okay, this is useful, but then I was like, oh, I still feel like I'm missing something, right? When you're just looking at some of the algebra, and I wasn't necessarily the strongest statistician or mathematician, so I was attracted to more other kinds of thought. And then I did the degree in Paris at Sciences Po, and the reason I went there as well was because it was an opportunity to do a degree in French before Sciences Po turned. Now it's primarily English, but I studied there when it was before that kind of shift happened, and I was still able to experience the very French kind of a system at Sciences Po, which is another kind of, if we had more time, a story in itself. But again, there I chose that to go to Sciences Po because, again, it was multidisciplinary. You had to study politics and history and what we'd say geography, in addition to some other kind of, I did quite a bit of finance and accounting courses, incidentally. And then I kind of landed, went back to the US for a year and a half, and then a friend of mine said, oh, you should come to Oxford and do a DPhil. And I said, okay, and so applied and then got in, and it happened to be in the geography school.
Yeah.
I did my DPhil with a guy named Gordon Clark. Now, do I feel like a geographer? I did the PhD there, and then I went to the University of Bristol and worked in the School of Geographical Sciences. But back to your question about what about economic geography as a discipline, and I guess the long, the short answer to that is, from my biography is I ended up doing the DPhil in geography and then remaining in a geography department as an academic, at least initially in my career, was because it was open, right? So in economic geography, I didn't feel that I was constrained in what I was reading and the kinds of questions I wanted to ask, right? So, a lot of the work that you do at King's, looking at institutional economics, right? So I've read lots of Eleanor Ostrom and institutional economics generally. I've read evolutionary economic theory, I mean, as in addition to kind of reading neoclassical economics and trying to understand what the economists are doing, or development economics, right? So it's quite broad. And the nice thing about geography, I would say generally as a field, is it's a microcosm of the university. When I was at University of Bristol and we had open days, I would say to parents and students there, mainly the parents, because you always have to sell it to the parents, right? You have to charm the mothers, and then they'll want their children to come to Bristol. And I would say, you come and do a geography degree here because, and I gave my experience as being, American, a university degree in America, it's liberal arts, right? You do lots of different courses, and that's what's nice about it. In Britain, you go and read physics for 3 years, or you go and read economics for a few years. But most of you, you're 17, 18 years old, you really don't know what you want to be when you grow up. And half of you want to go to the city anyways to make lots of money. And, as long as you can kind of count and, do some math, you'll be all right. What you really want to do is expand your horizons. And the nice thing about geography is you can do a degree in it and you study everything from physics to philosophy under one roof. And now that's not but some will say, oh, but that doesn't allow for specialization. I think that's not true, right? So everybody thinks, oh, it's just a general degree and it's doing maps and stuff. And I would say, no. I mean, when I think about the undergraduates I had at Bristol, they would leave with a high level of statistical training. They would leave, if they did more physical geography, understanding of climate modeling. Some would focus more on, there was quite a bit of French geophilosophy that they would leave with. So, they'd be experts on Foucault and Deleuze and, postmodern thought. And in addition, there was other kind of understanding of sociology and development. So they would leave with actually quite a bit of skills and knowledge that when I look at many of them now, it's been a number of years, but I follow some, LinkedIn with some of them, and they have amazing careers doing really interesting things. And so I think, that's for me what I'm attracted about being, being in geography notionally. But then even within the discipline, I've a lot of my publications, I've published quite a bit in, let's say, what you could call international political economy.
Yep.
I had a paper in a law journal once, right? So there's a freedom to do that, I think, which is liberating. And I would say that's one reason why why I was attracted to the job in Edinburgh to take up the Adam Smith chair, because they weren't looking for specifically for either what we think of as a classical kind of neoclassical economist, nor were they looking for someone that is per se a Smith scholar that can tell you every single quote that Smith ever wrote, but they wanted someone that was broadly capable of hosting, I would say, a range of different scholars, and being able to identify who we should bring into the house, what kind of activities should we have, how can we build an intellectual community, how can we bring different parts of the university, particularly because Heriot-Watt's primarily a STEM institution, very strong in computer science and in engineering, and how do we bring that kind of the tech crowd into the social sciences. And I think I'd like to think one of the reasons, they've told me actually they hired me, is that they think I have the capacity to be flexible and open and intellectually curious. And I would say that partly to do with the training I had, not simply in geography, but that exposure I had to not feeling that I had to be tied to one specific discipline. as an academic.
So was it through the work you were doing in economic geography or the IPE type material that you started to get interested in Adam Smith specifically? How did you actually develop that sort of interest there in some of his ideas and thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I would never claim to be an Adam Smith scholar. Now, if you ask me in 10 years' time, given the position I have, I will likely be an Adam Smith scholar just because I by default, I kind of need to do more Smith. I need to be more of a Smith kind of scholar. Though I look at so many of the amazing Smith scholars out there, and I just think there's such great work that why kind of what do I have to contribute, right? I mean, for example, your colleague at King's, Paul Sagar, I think his recent book on Smith is fantastic, and it's but again, going back to kind of what I was saying before, I like to read widely, and so I read Smith scholarship, and so I can kind of utilize it and mobilize it. But I guess to the bigger question about how I became interested in Smith, and one thing I say to people that come to Panmure House is that you have the Smith aficionados, right? Those that just kind of put him on this pedestal, and in a kind of way that Marxist scholars do with Marx, or critical scholars do with Karl Marx. They put him on this pedestal, and there's a bit of that with Adam Smith, and I'm always a bit kind of worried about that kind of hero worship, if you like. It can be quite. I think it kind of Smith would not want that. Let's say, I would think, and so
it's strange as well, isn't it? Because both Smith and Marx have a labor theory of value. So, and it's quite hard for Smith fans to be supporting a labor theory of value. I just thought I'd throw that one in.
No, it should. But I think so. What for me with how I came to being back to what I was saying about when people come to the house and I say we're all Smith scholars, whether we like to think it or not, and I say that, at least for those of us that have studied in the social sciences, is that even if you haven't read The Wealth of Nations or The Theory of Moral Sentiments, it has likely been influential of the people you have been reading, right? So, we've mentioned Karl Marx many times. Karl Marx was critical of Smith, but he was also kind of working in that tradition, right? So it's, Smith is part of the canon. He's there. And then I also say to people that, you're touched by Smith because he has also been so significant in terms of influencing policy, and even if it's influencing it in the wrong way, or in a way that Smith is not, wouldn't necessarily agree with, right? So his name has been used. So we're all kind of touched by Smith in a really important way. I mean, not everyone, but I think, but even then, I mean, people have told me, oh yeah, Smith, he's really popular in China, or used to be kind of, he's quite popular in China. And you think, oh wow, that's really interesting. There's a whole kind of, Smith scholarship happening in China. So this is where I would say that's my interest in Smith is always, it was, I've, as an undergraduate, you learn about, specialization and trade and the invisible hand. But I would say the interesting thing is, in hindsight, you think back, I don't know if I was taught Smith correctly, right? The more I read about Smith, or have read about Smith, as an academic, I think, oh wait a minute, how I was taught about Smith is wrong. Or when you see his, it's interesting how Smith is mobilized. Particularly in critical scholarship, it's always the Smithian market, the Smithian view of things, and you think it's just kind of this throw out, right? That's not actually very robust. And so that's where I would say that's kind of where I sit with Smith now, and now in the position I'm utilizing Smith much more. But for me, it's less again, like there's such great Smith scholarship out there, but for me, what's important and the things I want to do at Panmure House, it's the spirit of Adam Smith. It's the spirit of the Enlightenment. It's what we take for granted about what had happened in the 18th century that just was this flourishing of intellectual curiosity engagement that has shaped the modern world. And that for me is what's more important than, what did Smith say in book 6 of The Wealth of Nations? It's that 21st century, what could we do now? How can we be more open? How can we foster free speech, free debate, and ultimately free societies, right? So this comes back to, for me, the importance of liberal values and the importance of discussing those in a world where democracy is under threat, democracy is in decline globally. There's more authoritarian governments that are much more explicit and vocal, that are, so I think for me, that's what's more important than a specific, part of Smithian kind of thought. It's more the general liberal tradition. And here's where I think I'm probably becoming more of a vocal classical liberal, but I feel like we need to at the current kind of world conjuncture.
Well, that might be a good point to move on to the next question I was going to ask you. So, I mean, it actually relates to the title of your job. So you're Professor of Sustainable Capitalism. So can you tell us what is sustainable capitalism?
Right. So the interesting thing is, when I was approached for the chair, that title had already been decided, right? So they'd already decided on sustainable capitalism. And I thought to myself, okay, so I'm going to take this job, and all my, let's say, critical scholar friends, colleagues are going to laugh at me. What am I going to do with that? But then I look at it and think, then you tell people in the business world, and think, oh, that's fantastic. That's what we're thinking about. It's perfect, right? So I knew then going into it that some were going to hate it, some were going to love it. But for me, sustainable capitalism, the way I look at it is, the retort from those that are critical is that, well, capitalism is never sustainable. Then I think, yeah, but it's the most innovative economic system that we have and have ever had. And I would rather have capitalism than some form of authoritarian, control, which unfortunately the history of socialism was authoritarian in many ways. And so, on the one hand, depending on who I'm talking to, my response can be sustainable capitalism is how do we sustain capitalism, right? So I can play on the words, right? But I do believe it's, how do we sustain capitalism, but the good parts about capitalism, right? So, I'm not naive in the sense that there's still parts and, there's still exploitation that I think is unfortunate, right? There's still, things that we need to recognize, massive inequality, right? And we should try to find ways of doing that. But do I generally believe in a kind of market-based economy as being a better way of allocating resources and fostering innovation? Yes. But, that's a huge spectrum of how you do that, right?
Is there an environmental dimension to the sustainable capitalism as well?
So this is the kind of the other part of it, right? So the one part is this sort of sustainable capitalism, and how do we sustain capitalism in relation to other economic systems that are more authoritarian, less liberal. But then the other obviously is the sustainable in terms of the environment, and how do we kind of how do we not kill our planet, right? So I think that's the bigger, and that's the zeitgeist, right? That's what governments around the world, businesses around the world, investors are trying to figure this out, right? How do we make capitalism more sustainable, or how do we have green growth, if you like? I know there's degrowthers that think we should do something completely different, but I don't think that's realistic. And so again, I think part of what I want to do at Panmure House is understand what is sustainability, how can we make things more sustainable. And what I tend to tell people is I get really, and this is kind of my partly as an academic, you're necessarily skeptical of everything. And so when I look at ESG and corporate social responsibility, and so much of it just looks like virtue signaling, and and I think to myself, and again, this is where then I put my kind of more libertarian hat on, and I think, well, why should we have so much state intervention? Is this necessarily a good thing? What are the ways, and I know you've done some work on this as well, trying to understand, what are the policy options, and, what is government intervention that doesn't constrain, let's say, individual freedom, for example, right? So it's about bringing, and for me, again, it's what I want to do with Panmure House is bring multiple perspectives together to hash these things out, right? And I don't think
you could see that in different ways. There could be different combinations.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So just following up on that, you've also written quite extensively in your sort of academic work, published work, about the concept of state capitalism, and that's always struck me as an interesting concept. So you have people in the past who have been people within a certain form of Marxism have claimed that there's never been socialism. We've always had forms of state capitalism. I've never been convinced by those kind of arguments. Now you actually have people talking about a particular model of capitalism, which uses the state in a certain way, and they use it in a more positive sense. So I guess people like Mariana Mazzucato are in that camp, and some others. So can you say a little bit about how in your work you understand the term state capitalism? How do you define it?
Yeah, so if we have enough time remaining, I hope we do. So this came out of a project. I led a European Research Council project on sovereign wealth funds. And in the context of that, in 2018, I had a brilliant postdoc that came to work with me named Ilyas Alami, who's just started at Cambridge University. And one of the first things we did, because I'd always thought to myself, I keep hearing state capitalism. I personally had used it offhand a number of times, but not in a serious theoretical way. And I one of the first meetings that I had with Ilyas, I said, we need to do something on, let's write a paper where we just kind of think about what is state capitalism. And that's kind of spawned a series of different papers and special issues. Most of these are open access that so if people go to my Google Scholar profile, you can read most of those. And I should also say that we have a book coming out in probably the next 6 months with Oxford University Press, titled "The Specter of State Capital." And so basically what happened is then, Ilyas and I working together, and Ilyas is brilliant, and he's very well read in particularly in Marxist scholarship and state theory. That's one reason why I hired him, is he's brilliant in that regard, and he could do things that I can't, or bring me into contact with literatures that I wasn't so familiar with. And what we found is that what people meant by state capitalism was a number of different things, right? So you had people say state capitalism, they always associate with China, so it's a big state, and I never, nor Ilyas, kind of thought that was really credible, or they would say, oh, a sovereign wealth fund means there's a state capitalist, it's a state capitalist country, and then just there's and then there was a paper that came out in 2019, I believe, that where we go through these various theories. And it was also, like you mentioned, Mariana Mazzucato, right? So you see in the context of her kind of work, and so none of these theories we thought were credible. But one reason why we were motivated to kind of do this work was that, on the one hand, we saw more people using state capitalism as a concept, and we also saw more state capitalism, right? So if you look at the global economy, we have state-owned enterprises are huge. Sovereign wealth funds have grown significantly. Government spending programs after the financial crisis, after the pandemic, now with kind of climate change. If you're a libertarian, you're pulling your hair out if you look at, the supposed liberal countries of the world. And if you look at the global economy as a whole, I mean, it's just state everywhere, right? And so we thought we need to do some serious work about this, because we weren't willing to accept that state capitalism was just China. And so and we weren't willing to accept in a sort of varieties of capitalism mode where it's like, well, China is state capitalist, but the United States isn't. And you think, okay, well, there's significant differences between China, but then how do you account for the massive defense spending in the United States? How do you account for the Federal Reserve and its balance sheet? How do you account for the kinds of things that Matsukato is promoting, like Fred Bloch's, hidden developmental state in the United States? How do you kind of account for the norm in the last 200 years where you had massive state intervention and state ownership in the economy? And now we have more of that again. And so for us, then the definition of state capitalism, it's twofold, right? It's the I should read my definition that Elias and I have, so I get it correct in how do we do it. But the way we define it is that we would say, sorry, I should is that it is the aggregate expansion of the state's role as promoter, supervisor, and owner of capital across the world economy. And this is characterized by two parallel developments. So on the one hand, as I mentioned, it's the multiplication of what we call state capital hybrids. So it's state-owned enterprises, it's national development banks, and you see national development banks exploded across the advanced economies and developing economies. Sovereign wealth funds, as I mentioned. So these institutions, if you like, of state capital. And then in combination with what we would say the development of muscular forms of statism, right? So that's the kind of in the United States, it's the CHIPS Act, it's the Inflation Reduction Act, it's the kind of massive push by the state to drive innovation, to drive attention to climate change. And we see this everywhere. But for us, what's important, this is where the kind of the geographer comes in, is that we don't look at in terms of methodological nationalism, of comparing nation states, right? We look at it from why is it globally, so significant? Why now, right? And we have a few explanations for why does it ascend now? Why is it so significant? And this is I shouldn't give out too much because I want people to go and read the book.
Can I ask you? Can I ask you about this in the sense of, you mentioned briefly there, just flipping back a little bit, the varieties of capitalism literature. So are there varieties of state capitalism? It strikes me, if I'm thinking of two examples that you could think of as being state capitalist, but it seems to me in very different ways, would be China and Singapore.
Right.
So, China clearly has liberalized its economy a great deal compared to the way it was in the 1960s or 70s, but the state still plays a huge role. Singapore, the state is quite actively involved in the economic system in through various kind of nudge mechanisms. But at the same time, if you look at the size of the Singaporean state in terms of sort of government expenditure, it is far smaller than most of the European states.
Right.
So how do you sort of make comparisons there in terms of these varieties of state capitalism?
Yeah, so this is what we were trying to avoid, because again, what happens, and we criticize, there's papers that have done that, right, where they try to sort of quantify what is a state capitalist economy, because then they'll say, oh, it's 30% of state-owned enterprise, or it's some kind of quotient of so you quantify that. Those decisions on what that means is arbitrary, because then, like as you mentioned, right? So you take a comparison like Singapore, which has had at least a very kind of, and still does, I would say, like an active state policy, right? There's a plan there, right? But at the same time has very kind of liberal tendencies, and as you mentioned, like the size of the state is much smaller there than in Western Europe. Now, China, again, is an interesting case because it has, this is where it becomes difficult for us, because if I had to compare economies, yes, China is state capitalist and America isn't, just as Britain isn't. But what we've tried to do in our work is to avoid that kind of dichotomy, because again, what I find is that it makes it too easy to say China's state capitalist, But then you say, well, what about, as you just mentioned, look at the size of the state in Western Europe, right? So if China is state capitalist, then is Norway state capitalist, right? I mean, Norway has $1.3 trillion in a sovereign fund. Its national oil company and gas company is Prince money, and it is a massive welfare state, right? So it's, huge public expenditure. Is that not state capitalist, right? So then, so then you become the difficulty in comparing across countries. And for us, it's useful to have a way. So for us, it's like, well, what would, it's putting criticism, putting pressure on this concept of state capitalism, because it's not always, I think, useful. And the other point for us is that it allows us to question, this going back to, you mentioned Mariana Mazzucato, right? So she's making a positive case for state capitalism. And in our work, we don't make a positive or a negative kind of case, in the sense that we're trying to promote something, because it's more of just sort of setting out I mean, we do various things in the book, but it's it's kind of setting out the issues at hand and how people are utilizing this concept. But we do kind of put some pressure on some of these critical those, I would say, positive state capitalism kind of work, because again, I don't I'm less, I mean, this is where I kind of put my libertarian hat on, because I ask myself, well, because again, what's interesting, and this, I guess, what's important to point out about state capitalism as we see it now, is that state-owned enterprises, sovereign funds, most government intervention, it's still very market-based, right? So these state-owned enterprises are very competitive. They're trying to move. So it's not as if this is some kind of government planning, right?
No. Because they mostly operate in an international market sort of setting.
Exactly, right. And so this is where it's but then I ask myself, okay, but are they going to be most competitive, and how do you the concerns that liberals or libertarians have around too much state is, do they crowd out? Are they most effective? Are there other means of motivating and supporting economic growth or innovation? And this is not to say that Mazzucato's arguments aren't valid. I mean, I think there is something to be said about government research not receiving a good return on its investment, or the value, if you like, going to the private sector. But even then, I find that argument's really hard to, how do you then you create more state ownership, and you create a bureaucracy, and you create kind of some kind of strategic investment fund that is an ownership of these companies. And then I just find that I'm this is where I again, sort of become a classical liberal and sort of think, don't assume that your outcomes are going to happen, right? It's what are the unintended consequences.
So Adam, let me give you my take on this and see what your reaction is. So in a way, my take on this, I guess, would relate to the issues you've set out in terms of the problems of actually identifying what state capitalism is. So, I mean, I speak as someone who is, I would call myself a sort of market liberal, definitely. But coming from that position, I would never say that it's impossible for state enterprises to be successful, or that it's impossible for the state to have successful innovations in particular cases. I think what I would be saying is, for as many examples of success that you can find of the state in doing those kind of things, there are as many, if not more, examples of failure. And the problem that we have is actually spotting the conditions about when these interventions will work or when they don't work. And many of the success stories, to me, they look like they're kind of accidents that people subsequently give a kind of post hoc justification for. It's not clear that there's some underlying institutional theory that you could sort of try to design policy to bring about the beneficial outcomes. They always seem to arise from a kind of concatenation of events that there is no general theory for. So if we're thinking about sort of policy design, it seems to me we don't really get very far. That doesn't mean the idea isn't useful, but I'm skeptical of it more in the sense of sort of designing policy on the basis of this idea. So that's kind of my take.
That I think I would say we're 100% in agreement. I mean, you kind of, if you said that way more eloquently than I could, but I agree completely. And that's my reservation as well, is that if I take someone like Matsukato, I feel like she cherry picks really great examples.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you can look and say, well, the Americans put people on the moon and they did it really quickly. But that doesn't mean you can go to Scotland and tell, oh, just set up some entrepreneurial state and boom, you're putting men on the moon or whoever on the moon, right? It's like, it just, and I find, or look at what, BNDES in Brazil, it's been this great, development bank. It's like, really? So I agree with you. It's that it's really hard to find these examples. And I see this, I do a lot of policy work, or have done policy work, and engagement on sovereign funds and strategic investment funds, and looking at governments trying to set these up, and they'll look at these models. We want to be like Singapore. Look at what Temasek has done, how great it was, and what I find is that often they get the history wrong, right? So they're looking at Temasek today and not Temasek in the 1970s. Or ignoring kind of all the other massive kind of institutional things that have happened in Singapore that created the kind of success it is today. And so I would agree with you. This is if I find the challenge with the kind of state capitalist mode, or the kind of entrepreneurial state solution, is that I find that it, like you say, as a design thing, what steps do you need to go through, and how do you know you're going to get there? Because there's too many. So this is where I default on saying, well, okay, you want to have a sovereign fund. What for? What is the purpose? For some reason, if you have to manage natural resource revenues, there's lots of reasons to. If you want to set up, there's nothing wrong with setting up a strategic investment fund, but I wouldn't count on it to transform the economy. You can do it for a discrete thing. But ultimately, and I've said this in my policy work before, and in advising governments at the OECD a number of years ago, I said, well, there's basics that are more important, right? So it's, what's the quality of your education? What's the quality of your public financial management, right? I mean, it's like basic things. What is Parliament doing, right? So there's these kind of things that get the basics right first, and that's why, again, I kind of share your sort of market liberal take, is that we can't design this perfect thing. We can set up we can try to create some conditions and hope that there's good outcomes. But I think if you look at, again, so many of the examples of, take East Asian developmental states, right? You can pinpoint certain things that were really crucial decisions, but there's other things that were happening, like American military support and, different kind of things that supported that development. I think it's really hard to recreate that. And that's why, again, I say I'm not trying to provide a state capitalist kind of positive thing. If anything, I'm more skeptical than you would think.
Well, I've read some of your papers on this. I think they're really fascinating. So I'd really encourage some of our listeners to check them out. We're going to be tweeting out some of those on the Twitter feed in the next couple of weeks as well. But we're coming up to an hour, Adam, so we should probably draw to a close. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about what are the sort of forthcoming events you've got happening at Panmure House that people may have an interest in attending in the next few months. And
so the one coming up is on February 29th, and that's Branko Milanovic's lecture. We live stream that, and you can register to watch it. I would advise people to go to panmurehouse.org and sign up for our newsletter, and on the website you can find out where you can sign up to watch the live stream. And then after we'll have the video posted, and then sign up for the newsletter to find out more of what we're doing going forward. I mean, this is, like I said, we're a startup, and one of my jobs is to kind of actually turn it into the 21st century home of social and economic debate. So we have a lot of plans in store, and we're looking for more people to watch our material and contribute ideas as we go forward. And I just welcome people to be part of the journey of restoring the Enlightenment.
Well, it seems to me you've got off to a very good start as a startup. So just remains to say thank you very much, Adam, for joining us today on the Governance Podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.